All right, everybody, welcome to Lemurstream 51. We're back with another installment of Interaction Ritual Chains. This week we're looking at pages 9 to 12, where Collins covers a school of thought within sociology known as subcognitive ritualism. As always, I'm joined by my trusty interlocutor, John Hampson. John, how
Hey,
are you
how's it
doing this
going?
week?
I'm pretty good. How about you?
Uh, Doing pretty well myself. It's a nice sunny day here, so I'm pumped to get into a little bit more ritual interaction sociology.
Me too. I've got some spectacular sips here myself.
Oh, nice work. I've already had my coffee sips this morning, so my emotional and physical energy is way up already.
Let's keep it going.
All right, well, let me just turn on my stream sharing. Stream sharing, my screen sharing, so we can see the text, and we'll be good to go. All right, that should do it. Okay, so we're moving in on this page to a broad category within the chapter, traditions of ritual analysis. And Collins says he's going to highlight various approaches, schools of thought that are useful for situating theoretical problems he's going to deal with. And the first of these, which there seems to be a cluster around the late 19th century to the late 20th century, are what's called the cultural turn in sociology. And the first approach within this cultural turn is subcognitive ritualism. So Collins is not looking at rituals from the subcognitive perspective, but he's going to go over this, I think, to uh, allow people to engage with ideas which inform his theory but do not determine it.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. It's a lot more academic in nature. I've recognized the majority of these folks, but I think it's necessary to build up to his later, his synthesis of both sides, the functionalist ritualism as well.
Yes. So this should be helpful to us in locating his theoretical project. As we go on, we'll be able to see where he diverges and where he converges with what's come before him. Okay, so we were just discussing before we started, what do we understand by subcognitive ritualism?
It's like the pre-enlightenment era somewhat. These guys are looking backward in time to kind of see how how people's collective activities and individual relationship with each other and themselves and God and their different views, like what things seem to continue on in this ritualistic fashion for what reasons. And there's various reasons that you'll describe something as a ritualistic activity, theological, anthropological, economic, even. So it's just a kind of a survey of all these different views throughout history and through different thinkers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, to just define it more abstractly and very broadly, it seems to me that subcognitive ritualism understands ritual as emerging from unconscious impulses deep within both the individual and group psyche.
Mm-hmm.
So it fulfills uh, deeply seated human needs that are embedded within your cognitive structures subliminally.
I still think there's some matter of this going on today, and even the political space.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of, I think people are very woke, but they don't realize how much of their actions are really done subconsciously or leading from those types of principles.
Yeah, so let's have a look. He's starting off here. looking at where subcognitive ritualism, the context it came out of. So people started looking at the ancient sources of Greek and Roman property law. Then you had religious scholars probing ancient religions, all this kind of stuff. Nietzsche comes along in the 1870s, contrasting the Apollonian cults with the bawdy Dionysians. So I'm assuming that this started off the subcognitive ritual tradition because these guys are looking at the phenomenon of societies through basically an irrational lens. They're not trying to make sense of it as logical structures. So you look at Roman law from its social origins as opposed to its own internal logical coherency.
Yeah, it's applying what he was talking about in the last section about situations. And I think a lot of these authors that he discusses, we're not really looking at it the way he intends, but the way that he constructs their ideas is from a situationalist first approach.
Yes. So it seems here, he says at the bottom of page 9, in the early years of the 20th century, these classicists, their work crystallized around various theorists here like Harrison and Murray. And what they did is they programmatically interpreted all myths in terms of cult practices of their original adherents. So, like I was saying, rather than understanding the phenomenon on its own terms, they're looking at the genealogy of its social origination.
Do you think that, I don't think he really says this here, but could we assume or could we say that Collins looks at these things rising up from specific people, or is it more from a human-oriented platform? You know, is this something that he might believe that could happen in any era based on a certain condition, or do you think that these people he's observing are kind of connected to these activities specifically? You know, in a cultural sense, is that mapping from a genetic sort of approach versus just a culture, something
do
that
you
can
mean
kind of change over time?
the approaches, or what the approaches are analyzing?
Yeah, I mean, what he's analyzing. I don't think he kind of specifically states that. It may be stated later, but are these, you know, and what we're trying to do is figure out how some of these interaction ritual chains can be synthetically generated. Would he say the same thing, or are we just looking at these historical situations of people and seeing the emergence because of a genetic thing, or is it something that's more broadly human? Is it something that could be placed onto almost any person and still remain true?
Well, he says the ritual being determined by the overall structure, I think, at the granular level. I mean, I suppose there's a very complex way that would interact with biology, but he's definitely within the social constructionist tradition. He's not a biological determinist by any means. Now, we've got an interesting word here on the top of page 10, summing up this tradition of pragmatically interpreting myths. Epigrammatically. I've not come across that word before. Epigram, isn't that some kind of diagram of sorts?
Yeah, with words. It's like a small quote. Pithy saying or remark. It's just like a, you know, one-liner sort of.
Yeah, I'll just look up what is meant by epigram. Oh, I see. Yes, you're right. A pithy saying or remark expressing an idea in a clever or amusing way. Interesting. All right. Well, there's a new word for this.
It's a Twitter really enjoys this as well.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what Twitter's supposed to be. All right, so I thought we were getting introduced to some profound conceptual term there, but he's just using technical terms. So primitive religion was not so much thought out as danced out. There's your subcognitive ritualism summed up in that pithy
This
way.
this reminded me of that quote from Nietzsche, who said, "I could not believe in a God who couldn't dance," which is not directly connected, but I think it points to the same thing. It's got to be a subconscious, lived experience, and not something that's just intellectualized, or
Yeah.
even ritualized into a traditional space. It has to be felt and lived.
Yep. So he says that these thinkers like Nietzsche were looking at myths and conjectures about cult practices, and then they were correlating them with what the historical record showed, but it wasn't particularly systematic or theorized. So it was more, it was kind of emerging from the historical record, but there was interpretations of that, but there wasn't yet theoretical explanations being proffered.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to place this in anything for us with what we're looking at. Is this something like, are we doing a survey to see, are these the limitations of what ritual can provide? I would assume he's going to provide more examples, but should we be trying to do these types of activities? Is there like a qualitative assessment of what these can do, or is it just a historical review for our purposes to understand that word better?
I think it's a historical review, so he can familiarize his readers with the bodies of thought that he's going to draw upon and diverge from. He dabs on the feminist thinking here about goddess-centered fertility cults coming before male ones. I mean, we largely know that's nonsense now.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a few glimpses here and there, but it doesn't seem to largely be true.
Yeah, and then he goes on about the primitive mentality, which was something that was being looked at sociologically, which apparently now has been repudiated by post-colonial theory. One wonders, there's probably a good and a bad to that, because there's, on the one hand, the obsession with what's it called, the noble savage, but on the other, the noble savage has those qualities of raw force that are entirely illiberal.
That's kind of what spurred my earlier question. Is this something we need to kind of observe and maybe harness in a way? Is this something that's human and provides some power going forward? Or are we waiting for Collins, his approach, to provide us something unique?
I think we're going to be. He's seeing these as partial explanations, but he's going to give a more multivariate one by factoring all these in with his own, or synthesizing them and then adding his own interpretation to develop the tradition. So I think we're just going to have to soldier through his systematic laying out of his influences. There's a key sentence here. All of these approaches used the evidence of ritual and myth for historical reconstruction. Thus, their theorizing tended to be rather concrete, looking for early historical stages which were sometimes constructed as universal evolutionary patterns. So they weren't looking to generate independent explanatory bodies of theory. They just wanted enough theory to be able to interpret a historical cultural era, and then what they would do is they would probably link them together in a chain and use that as a kind of master narrative for how history unfolds. Nietzsche doing that with his genealogy of morality.
Of course, we have Freud, the coke fiend, here, becoming woke and prescribing these psychological views of uh, rituals that humans conduct and injecting
Mhm.
that into the cultural discourse.
Yeah. Well, Freud's like the ultimate kind of subcognitive essentialist.
He's the main
He's
subject of his own theory. If you look at his life, it's fairly odd in the way that he wrote too. It's kind of one and the same.
hmm Um, yeah, so he's talking about how Freud thinks about his sons implementing rituals to deal with the guilt of killing their fathers. So there's like there's a clear example of what is meant by subcognitive ritualism. So you see that the ritual, the outward effect, is incited by the inner need based upon human psychology and social psychology when people are interacting with one another to do what's necessary to sustain a society. So obviously Collins is drawing from this, but he's not going to uncritically accept it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that a lot of the later thinkers took from Freud as like an origin point of how to intellectualize these types of situations. People compounded on top of his theories, or interjected, or argued against, or this and that. But yeah,
Yeah.
he does kind of back up from each of the approaches and kind of re-examines each one systematically.
Yep. So he says Freud was operating with the theory derived from embryological development that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What's ontogeny?
I don't have that word highlighted. Let's see. Ontogeny. Actually, that's the first thing that came up for my search.
Mm-hmm.
Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is part of a recapitulation theory.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
But what is
a
ontogeny
branch of
itself?
biology that deals with ontogenesis, where I need to review that word itself. The development of an individual organism or anatomical or behavioral feature from the earliest stage to maturity. So, contrasted with phylogeny, would that be more cultural additions? Evolutionary development and diversification of a species or group of organisms. Okay, so rather than an individual, a more group-oriented approach.
Okay, so yeah, that makes sense. So that's the group giving subconsciously generating rituals for itself.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So that's
Okay, so
Freud.
he's allowing the individual psyche to kind of emerge in a critical way
Yeah.
at this point.
So he's locating Freud within the subcognitive approach, and then he goes on to talk about the way intellectual movements develop. So he says that it's a combination of new data emerging and the existing body of work as it's reformulated to deal with that data. So that's the dialectic of enlightenment. Uh, and Collins' formulation.
Yeah, it seemed like it only happened once, and here we are, enlightened, and still can't make much sense of it. It seems each generation is this something he called to earlier about just the stacking up from one generation to the next and making recombining, negating, abstracting existing ideas, where he quotes himself.
mm-hmm.
Did he quote his own book right there? Or is that another? I didn't.
It is. I think it's public. It's one on public intellect or public rituals or something.
Okay.
Philosophers of each new generation operate within a lineup of existing intellectual
He's
factions.
working in a tight space here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says it gives a limited number of moves that can be made by recombining, negating, and abstracting existing ideas. And that's interesting.
Seems like he's creating his own theory by reinforcing it repeatedly, creating his own chain as he goes along very slowly.
All right, so moving on, as what's he talking about up here? Okay, so as anthropology and sociology took shape, what's happened? Oh yeah,
I think ritual is probably the most central idea within anthropology. It's like the foundation of analysis is looking how people in groups organize themselves, what kind of things they consider to identify them as unique and stuff like that. So I've seen that word use that a lot more in that area. Rites of passage here.
Okay, so the intellectual field is beginning to move from understanding ritual because it crops up in a historical context to applying it as a distinct theory to social phenomenon.
Life is ritual until the more recent atomization through modern society seemed to be the substance of human life.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what he's tracing this realization right now. And so he says that I will take the Durkheimian formulation as emblematic of the intellectual achievements of the early classicists, ancient and religious historians, and field anthropologists. So for him, Durkheim has integrated all of these evolutions in thought into a coherent explanation. And it's from there he's either going to diverge, challenge, or draw from to expand on that movement.
Yeah, Durkheim read a book. Here he points to the elementary forms of religious life. I've seen that, but I have not read it. But that would probably be much more contextual for this type of discussion.
Yes. So he says, why is it appropriate to call this movement subcognitive ritualism? Rationality and more generally all belief is the surface of human consciousness. It is what first meets us usually in idealized form, like the beautiful myths of the Olympian gods or sermons from the pulpit drawing upon the Hebrew Old Testament. The programs of ritual analysis goes beneath this surface. In an evolutionist generation, this procedure was often seen as stripping away modern rationality to find its irrational foundations or historical roots. If the image is reminiscent of Freud depicting ego emerging out of the passions of the id, it is appropriate to remember that Freud was working in the same generation as von Gennep, and Durkheim and was drawing upon some of the same sources of material.
Okay, yeah, here we go. It's kind of what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, so I think we were right when we kicked things off that it's subcognitive ritualism is centered around the idea of seeing an irrational preconceptual origin to ritual. So I can see ways already in which Collins is going to diverge from this. I think he's going to see ritual as more of as a self-organizing phenomenon that, as we already know, he doesn't believe that it comes exclusively from the structure of a group as a whole or even from the individual psychology, because he sees individuals as precipitated by the interactions they go through.
Right. In this approach, that if you'll notice that he's using the heavyweights and the momentum from these other thinkers in a way to shape his. I mean, would Collins be recognized without his approach using all of these other heavyweight thinkers in such a an eloquent build-up? So I mean, I think he's showing us right here kind of how it's done. You have to use the best and the brightest moving forward, take some of that energy and then craft it into a fine sharp spear,
Oh yes,
something that we're trying to kind of do.
I don't think he's dealing with this to dismiss them. He's just, from his view, they offer a limited explanation, and he's going to take what, like you said, what's of value and discard what's not no longer relevant, what's been superseded, which is implied whenever you generate a new theory to explain something, you're superseding something else.
I wonder how much he's gonna push them into the ground later on when he gets into his own theory.
Mm-hmm. What he does say here, this is something we should take note of. Apparently, this the evolutionary postulate, which has to do with seeing how rituals emerge from the irrational and then find like a I'm guessing that's what he means by evolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever it is, it's become a whipping boy, and that he doesn't. So he believes this is what he may be taking. He says that subcognitive ritualism does not stand or fall with social evolutionism.
Okay, that's what I was asking earlier.
Mm.
So it is more of like a substrate that's human. It just is. It's not really accidental, but it's happenstance that this is developed in a certain way with which to study it. So then you can
Yes.
take and apply in any kind of context going forward if you understand it.
Got it. Okay, so we can use subcognitive ritualism without necessarily having to look at it in terms of a way it's evolved society. So then he goes on to say, analytically, the point is that ideas and beliefs are not sufficiently explained in their own terms. So you have to look at the way subcognitive programs lead to their manifestation.
Situation first.
Yep.
I don't see one mention of agency here at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess, well, I can see that he would strongly be attracted to that element of subcognitive ritualism, but at the same time, I don't think he's going to see the subcognitive approach as being able to totally explain what a
I don't
ritual
either.
interaction is and why it forms. So
He's not too warm to it. He's fairly cold in his approach here in this section.
mhm. This is a useful point in and of itself, where he says that ideas and beliefs are not sufficiently explained in their own terms. This is something I've already applied in many cases when we're looking at discourse, say, within the alt-right. We can say whether these ideas have a truth to them or not, whatever their veracity, there's a second order of analysis which can take place as to why the ideas are being engaged with, and the relationship of the individual and the group to these ideas.
What's interesting here, he says that religious ideas are a special case and that they're somewhat different, that they're continuing because they have these, I guess, compounded emblems of membership in the group. And, I mean, you look at some of, people want to cast away religious value, but I think that's more than the substance of religion. It's more that it also carries a very strong ritual chain that I don't think people give enough understanding to. Even if not belief, there's much more reason to be a part of a religious worldview.
Mm-hmm.
He says it's somewhat different in that regard.
Yeah, so emblems of membership in the group that assemble to carry out rituals. Yeah. So again, this relates back to his earlier idea that ideas can be imprinted with emotional energy and then used to demarcate group membership.
Well, that's where it's different, though, because he says that pretty much everyone has a different viewpoint in that same group, but the group itself lives externally to them, so it has a much bigger life. It's not. It doesn't matter necessarily the individuals there. It's about the collective ritual happening itself. That
Yeah.
structure.
Mm.
Going on, I guess, to separate religion from simply moral beliefs. which he talks about
I think
next.
he talks about how he sees morality arising from interactions down here. Hmm.
So there's like these different changes that happen within the individuals and also the external group as a dynamic form, but there's also some of them that leave a residue that becomes real all on its own, which specifically like religious or
Here's another quote by him on what is meant by subcognitive ritualism. So he says here the subcognitive interpretation of rituals explains cognition by social practices, especially ritual practices. So there we get another dimension of what is meant by that. So your thinking is affected by the ritual practice, and then the ritual practice in turn is coming from subliminal impulses.
well, maybe you could say that there's like a tectonics of different religious groups that are sort of completely walking on their own and crashing into each other. But the thing that makes them up is not really the individuals because those players can change sides, they can change views, but there is still this thing that lingers on, um,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that isn't, it's totally outside of anyone's control.
Yeah, he says here the thrust of the argument and the logic. Oh, sorry, no, I'm reading in the wrong place. He says that um,
It's got a
moral
cosmological concept.
moral beliefs are also constituted by ritual practice. So he does not see morality as distinct from the sociology of a group that arises from the dynamics of their interaction.
Hmm. It's more
Uh,
local.
and then he relates this back to Nietzsche and his original distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian, the way you organize a society uh, determines the kind of morality it has. So the slave
That seems to
morality
be
of
one of the largest arguments people have against different religious views. And when they argue about religion, they usually point to the moral beliefs, which are not really uh, self-similar with the religion itself. The
yeah.
religion is a construct that logically operates and kind of uses people um, as participants.
Hmm. So your morality depends upon your interaction ritual. And so I guess you could say that the religion, really what he's doing is he's broadening the initial analysis of sociological analysis of religion, and sociology has gradually broadened that to understand how those rituals are expressed in secular society, but in a less explicit form.
Hmm. Unpacking.
So we get on to here. I think that you've mentioned before this Moores guy, and he talks about how rituals could be used to set up temporary exchanges across group boundaries. So this is the um, discussion of gift giving and culture.
Yeah, he read that book, The Gift. I don't think he added maybe another thing that could be seen. It's just really that there's an economic residue, that there's like a physical component, whether it's food or some kind of gift that has no consumptive value, that these are ways in which you can understand how people are connected. So you can kind of look at economic uh, trends or ledgers of history to kind of validate these ideas and not just study people and have interpretations, but actually see what their connections were, why they decided to connect, and make
Hmm.
assumptions from that. So he was actually one of the very first people to have an economic theory about how people, essentially how people developed economics from this very early tribal viewpoint, and then made us, kind of assumptions going forward.
Yeah. So Durkheim learned that ritual participation sets the boundaries of groups, and hence the boundaries of moral obligation. So we don't. This is if you think of that in the terms of the contemporary political spectrum, like that's an anti-universalist idea. It's particularistic. There's no such thing as an obligation to take in Syrian refugees or something because they do not engage in our rituals. Our morality doesn't extend to those groups.
Yeah, and people that are contrary to that will point at your need for morality when it's you've already resolved that for yourself, or you've already had that understood.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
don't have to.
and um, so then you've got I suppose Mouse is looking up how that moral field can be expanded by gift giving across boundaries. But then he goes on to
Hmm.
note that it can lead to conflict as well.
It's interesting. It's like I was mentioned, like the tectonics of it. So I guess he's leading in using mouse, and then this last section, how certain societies or groups may combat each other or make amends with each other and make ties and stuff. So it's not just the individual, it's not just the group, but now it's a multiplicity of groups and individuals who are many layers of these things happening at the same time. Maybe one person's doing it at this level of things, but another
Mm-hmm.
person's engaging on a different level. So
Yeah.
that's where it gets really confusing, and so you had to kind of unpack it up to here.
So he says that the key point is Durkheimian analysis provides not only a sociology of knowledge, but a sociology of morals. This will lead us into the sociology of emotions. Note the progression: knowledge and morals, then emotions. And this explains the passions of righteousness, retribution, and rebellion. A sociology encompassing both anger and love. This should be interesting because liberals have a one-dimensional view of the emotional spectrum. They want to talk about love as if you can disentangle that from anger or from
Hmm.
hate. One implies the other. There's a coin always has an obverse.
It's going to get a little objective with some very near and dear theories.
Mm.
So we're going to definitely have to back up a little bit more to see the full picture.
Well, he says here, and this is perhaps an explanation of him of why he's surveying this material at the very. This is the very last sentence in this section. The principles crystallized by the earlier generations of students of ritual are permanent additions to our stock of sociological knowledge, building blocks out of which more complex theories have been constructed.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I'm
that's a
interested to see his other approach.
Yeah, well, it looks like he's going to. It's the way that you assemble what has come before, which, and you combining that with your own understandings. That is the point of genesis of his interaction ritual theory. So we
It's
know.
important what not to include too, knowing it's false or misleading.
So he's basically describing the materials he's going to be building with and where those materials themselves came from when they were the point of actual theoretical application. Now they're being taken and integrated themselves into wider theories.
I like it. This was a little bit drier, but I think we've made some good observations about what he's really getting at here and where he might go.
Yeah, well, the next section is on functionalist ritualism, so that will provide us with yet another leg of the stool his theory is sitting on. So that will be that's what we can get into next week.
I hope it's a little. I've browsed through it a little bit, and I'm not as familiar with these thinkers. I probably not approach this type of study. I see how he's also goes into Goffman, talking
Hmm.
about his earlier theories. There's quite a bit more to build up before we get to his original thesis.
Yeah, I think it's worth it though, just to establish where everything is, where he's coming from, because the more I read of this book, the more relevant it seems.
it's like a process of burning away. Like I continue to have assumptions that I'm building from one section, and then he tears them down in the next. And so it's, he's going to let us know, but it's an interesting process to go through reading this book in this way, little by little. It's taking some time to let it sink in, evaluate it different ways, and um, I asked you, like I think about a week ago, if you're getting some synthetic, synthesis
Hmm.
concepts coming up, and it continues to kind of tear those down. The more I kind of reach out to make an assumption based on what he said, he's already addressed that in the next area. So I
Mm.
like what he's doing. It's really different than a lot of other thinkers in this area where they're simply trying to appeal and provide you their explanation, their rationalization. And he's doing something entirely different where he's teaching you how to be an engineer of thought
Yeah.
in a way, an engineer of these rituals. And so that's really what we embarked on to do. So it's just kind of, it's a little bit different, but I like it.
For sure, I like that term, an engineer of thought. That's what we're doing. We're building new structures of thought that give us an applied edge of knowledge. And
Hmm.
that's what is going to propel our project when you get right down to it. Just checking the chat before we close off. Oxstone says the ritual streaming on ritual. So we're practicing what we're preaching as we're preaching it.
It's important. I see more and more how Collins has set his book up to do the same.
Yeah, yeah. So recursion. Oxstone also wants a list of different ultraviolet memes. Yes, I may try to find a way of making them available. I'll think about that, Oxstone. So that's pretty much us for today. It's been another engaging stream. Thank you, John, for your participation, and
Yeah, thanks
thanks.
for hosting.
No problem. Thanks for the people who've signed in to chat, and we'll be back at a similar time next week for the next installment. But for now, that's another Lemurstream over and out. Catch you later, guys.